Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome all to our roundtable discussion on the Delta 8.7 policy guides, assessing what works to achieve SDG Target 8.7. My name's Angharad Smith, and I'm a Programme Officer for the Modern Slavery Programme at United Nations University Centre for Policy Research. Before we turn to our panel discussion with the excellent moderator, Bikini Wazuri, and the three chairs of the policy guide process, I'd first like to explain why we, Delta 8.7, undertook this initiative and briefly talk you through the policy guide process itself. In 2015, 193 member states pledged their commitment to Target 8.7 of the SDGs. Target 8.7 commits member states to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labor in all of its forms. But what are effective measures? And what does work to end modern slavery? Delta 8.7, a project supported through two phases of work by the Modern Slavery Innovation Fund at the UK Home Office, seeks to expand the evidence base on effective measures. The policy guides were created in part to answer this question. Between April 2020 and March 2021, Delta 8.7 convened global expert working groups to produce three policy guides to address what works to achieve Target 8.7 in three broad domains: justice, crisis, and markets. The purpose of these policy guides is to provide a highly credible and current articulation of what we know about the global and national policies needed to accelerate progress towards Target 8.7 in a format that is useful for policy actors. They provide a snapshot of what works to achieve Target 8.7. The specific audience for these guides is multilateral and national level policymakers. The guides do not seek to dictate to policymakers how they should organize to achieve Target 8.7, because that requires an understanding of the specific challenges in each country, the available resources, and other contextual factors. Instead, they aim to provide an evidence-based policy resource that is useful across contexts and to policy actors around the world, including those thinking about multilateral policy frameworks. Whilst our intended audience is policy actors, we hope that the guides will be useful tools for civil society and academics looking to influence policy in their own context. The policy guides prioritize scientifically rigorous information regarding what works. And as a result, the guidance offered is neither comprehensive nor definitive. It is thorough and deep in areas where evidence is comprehensive and robust, while in other cases, it is patchier and more speculative. This will, however, help to highlight areas where evidence is strong and areas where it is lacking. The deliberative process by which the policy guides are formulated is designed to be replicable. The aim is to capture the current state of knowledge on what works and allow future editions of these policy guides to reflect changes in the underlying state of knowledge. The drafting process for these policy guides is modeled after other relevant international processes, combining mixed sources of expertise to reach consensus on policy options, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Delta 8.7 convened three global expert working groups to produce the policy guides. Members were selected following an open call for nominations. The process endeavored to include survivor expertise in each working group consultation process, through having survivor members in the working groups and through bespoke consultations on the draft policy guide documents. Working group members were allocated into subgroups based on their expertise and asked to assess the two research inputs for the hypotheses linked to their respective subtheme. So what were these research inputs? First, assembling the evidence. Between July and September 2020, Delta 8.7 assembled a database of evidence on what works to achieve Target 8.7. This was achieved through two processes: a public submission of evidence, and a non-comprehensive evidence review carried out by the Rights Lab, University of Nottingham. Both of these processes sought to identify sources and bodies of evidence that are based on rigorous scientific methods and/or have been tested through government implementation. For each piece of evidence submitted, information on over 20 different data points were collected. This database enabled the working groups to map the contours of bodies of evidence relating to specific thematic areas and specific hypotheses about what works to achieve Target 8.7. The database was mapped in two ways, qualitatively and quantitatively. Both approaches offered assessments of the strength of evidence associated with specific themes and, where possible, specific hypotheses. The strength of evidence was broken into three components. First, diversity of evidence. This indicates the variety of type, methods, and design of the evidence associated with different themes and hypotheses. This data allowed each working group to distinguish themes and hypotheses that have been explored through a variety of research and implementation approaches from those that are backed by less diverse evidence. Second, size of body of evidence. This quantifies the size, scale, and geographic reach of evidence associated with a theme or hypotheses. This helped the working group identify themes and hypotheses that have been more extensively tested. Third, technical quality of evidence. This derives from data provided by submitters related to evidentiary quality, allowing the working group to understand both which themes and hypotheses were backed by evidence that is perceived to be of high quality. Third, assessing the evidence. Working groups considered these background documents, the Rights Lab non-comprehensive evidence review, the underlying database, and the Delta 8.7 quantitative assessment, and reworked them using a shared template into a policy guide aimed at providing a snapshot of evidence on what may work to achieve Target 8.7. Some of their duties included identifying evidentiary sources that were missing and needed to be incorporated, discussing the strength of evidence associated with each theme and/or hypotheses, identifying other interventions or hypotheses that were not reflected in evidence but may be promising, and assigning a confidence score to each hypothesis. Working groups were asked to indicate their level of confidence in the effectiveness of an intervention or the validity of the hypotheses using a prescribed scale. Confidence in the certainty of a finding is based on the strength of evidence. This is assessed on the diversity of evidence, size of body of evidence, and technical quality of the evidence, and on the experience of working group members. This created a metric for the working group to discuss, consider, and validate the two primary research inputs into the policy guides, the Rights Lab evidence review and the Delta 8.7 quantitative score. The evaluation to obtain a confidence score acts as an additional quality check, allowing the working group to assess bodies of evidence that the two research inputs may have struggled to recognize or map. The degree of certainty in key findings is therefore based on the working group's evaluations of the two primary research inputs. In the policy guide documents, it is expressed as a qualitative level of confidence from very low to very high. As previously mentioned, the policy guide process is an adaptive and innovative model, and we adapted the assignment of confidence scores during the process, developing a more inclusive and shared narrative about labor exploitation, forced labor, and modern slavery that was based on the available evidence examined, but also, and very importantly, on a synthesis involving the diverse personal research and practical experience of the working group members. The evidence base was not used as the sole indicator of the strength of hypotheses, but a starting point in a multi-stage adaptive process towards setting and refining policy parameters. Delta 8.7 assembled these working groups to include practitioners and policy actors precisely because it aims to bridge the research to policy divides. With this in mind, working groups were able to include an implementation note in cases where a hypothesis may seem to have contradicted their own experience of practice or policy implementation, or if they felt it necessary to include a comment that provides additional nuance or shading to a conclusion. As previously mentioned, the purpose of these policy guides is to provide a highly credible and current articulation of what we know about the global and national policies needed to accelerate progress towards Target 8.7 in a format that is useful for policy actors. They provide a snapshot of what works to achieve Target 8.7. So I'd like to now hand over to our moderator and panelists who will share that snapshot with you, engage in a discussion on the drafting exercise, the scope of the project, initial findings, and lessons learned. Before I do that though, I'd like to make a quick round of introductions. Moderating this panel is Bikini Wazuri, Free the Slaves Executive Director and Policy Guide Steering Group member. Bikini has led organizations, programs, and projects in Africa, Europe, North America, and around the world. He has decades of expertise on human rights, global justice, and technology. He has led research on children and women and armed conflict in Africa and the Middle East, women living in servitude in the Middle East, the use of mobile technology to advance global justice and human rights. His advocacy and evidence were instrumental in the International Criminal Court's first case on war crimes against children of the Democratic Republic of Congo, his native country. He has made presentations at high-level audiences, including the United Nations Security Council, the United States Congress, and the Assembly of States parties of the ICC. We are delighted to have him here today. Joining us for the panel discussion is Ruth Juliet Nyambura Gachanja, Chair of the Justice Working Group. Juliet is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. She is a child rights and anti-human trafficking specialist with an LLM in minorities rights and the law from Middlesex University and an LLB from Moi University, Kenya. Currently, she works as a child rights technical advisor and as a law lecturer at Kabarak University. She is championing the work of Love Justice International, an international NGO that works on intercepting human trafficking through transit border monitoring. And Ms. Gachanja also serves as the board chairperson of African Institute for Children's Studies. Previously, she served as the first chairperson of the first advisory committee on human trafficking, established under the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act in Kenya. Second, we have Catherine Bryant, chair of the Crisis Group. Catherine leads the European engagement at Walk Free, initiative of the Minderoo Foundation and co-author of the Global Slavery Index. Ms. Bryant oversees Walk Free's research program focused on what works to combat modern slavery, including the government response component of the GSI and the Promising Practices database. She has worked in counter-trafficking and anti-slavery program in research for the past 10 years. Anna Pina, chair of the Markets Group, serves as Global Vice President, Corporate and Government Affairs at International Justice Mission, where she leads IGM's global strategy for partnering with governments, international organizations, and multinational corporations. IGM's global partnerships team applies learning from 2 decades of work combating slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, and gender-based violence to build effective partnerships that result in measurable change to people suffering injustice. So without further ado, I will pass over to our excellent moderator and panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angrad, for that amazing outline of the policy guide, the process, and the expectations that we may have for this important tool. Let me also join Angrad in welcoming everybody, wherever you are, to this very exciting and full of lessons panel discussion that we're going to have today. As I know, you in the audience, you'll have quite tons of questions, and we want to welcome those and make sure we can have them. So I want to give you a tip. So on the Zoom, you will see, the Q&A box that you can just, go there and then, insert your question anytime as the panel goes on. So thank you so much again, everybody, and to our wonderful panelists. I'm honored to be part of this event, and also as one of the policy guide steering committee member. It was really a masterful job that was undertaken almost a year ago with the wonderful chairs of the different working group. I also want to thank everybody who, one way or another, participated in this process. So today we have an exciting moment and also an opportunity to explore one of the biggest questions as that we may have in mind. What actually works to end modern day slavery in the world? And for that, we have the best expert we can have, in the world. And this question will be the starting point of our discussion. And please feel free to add other questions in the Q&A box as we want to hear also from you again as the discussion goes on. Now, as we explore this question, I want to ask the panelists if they can walk us through what they think really from their findings, from what they have learned throughout this process, and from their own expertise. What actually works to end modern slavery, as it's a bigger question to the point that the UN has dedicated the whole SDG to really tackle this main issue. So for that, I would like to invite Miss Catherine Bryant, if you can walk us through what you think for you is, what actually works to end modern slavery from what you have gone through this whole process.
Thanks so much, Bikini, and it's a real pleasure to join you all this afternoon to talk about this question of what works and to try and answer that question about what works. I think kind of my initial reflection, having gone through the policy guide process and developing with the working group the crisis guide, is that we still don't quite know the answer to that question of what works. I think we're longer along than we were this time last year, but we still don't have kind of the silver bullet to end modern slavery. However, there are kind of three really interesting findings that I just want to draw out from our working group discussions and also from the policy guide on crisis. First of all, it's really what struck me through this and through some of our previous work as well at Walk Free is the importance of looking at crisis and the intersection between crisis and migration. And that came out really strongly in the evidence that people on the move as a result of forced migration due to displacement or due to crisis situations are increasingly vulnerable to exploitation. And that's something that we should be really taking into account into our policy responses or pragmatic responses to modern slavery in crisis settings. We know that those on the move are much more vulnerable to exploitation and they have limited access to health, to accommodation, and also can face detention or restrictive immigration policies, which can increase their vulnerability. So that's one of the key things that came out in the policy guide. Secondly, also making sure that we have a gender lens to our policy responses. We know that women and girls are much more vulnerable to exploitation, and this is particularly the case in crisis settings. So therefore, when we're responding to this, we need to make sure that we take that into account. And then thirdly, the key thing that came out really strong in the policy guide was the importance of collaboration. And I think this will probably be the same across all the policy guides, but especially in humanitarian settings, that we should be focusing on how we can have a multi-sectoral, multi-agency response to these forms of exploitation. And luckily in humanitarian settings, there is precedent for this. We've been doing a little bit of work with the Global Protection Cluster, for example, to make sure that we are thinking about anti-trafficking responses in humanitarian settings. So they're the three kind of key findings from the policy guide. And I just want to take the opportunity just to thank the subgroup leads within our working group, as that's John Frame, Sylvia Tabasca, Tina Davis, Patricia Hines, and Sophie Otiendi. Thank you so much for all of your work in pulling together this guide within the working group. So that's kind of my key findings. I can go on and talk about some of the gaps, but I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to also talk about the key findings first, or if you'd like me to also talk about gaps at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for pointing out those kind of three key findings that you find in the crisis, a group that you led. And Anna, what did you find on your side in terms of how to go about this question of what really works to end modern slavery?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bukeni. And it's a pleasure to join you all. Thanks also to the Delta 8.7 team for organizing it. This process really was very impressively well organized. So thanks to Alice and Ankarad for that. And also to my subgroup leads for the markets working group, that's Eleanor Harry, Samantha Floyd, and Mina Chang, who really focused on the drafting of the policy guide. So very grateful for their work. To answer the question, we focused in the markets working group on economic and trade policy, development, regulation of supply chains. On the plus side, I'd agree with Catherine, we know a lot more than we did in 2015 when the SDGs were set. We highlighted a number, I think the research highlights a number of promising practices that we can build on. It also talked about extensive collaboration happening between the various stakeholder groups related to research and implementation. So there's a number of positive signs. I think a high proportion of the studies incorporated interviews with workers in supply chains, which was a significant part of the research. They also pointed to initiative positive trends as a result of collaboration, different types of collaboration, so pre-competitive collaboration among corporations, as well as between corporations and NGOs. So there's a lot of positive trends and best practices that are emerging. But it was clear definitely from the research that collaboration wasn't sufficient on its own, that there are sort of pointers towards we're also going to need regulation and increasing enforcement of laws that exist. And also the fact that in terms of markets, regulation of supply chains, for instance, all of those developments are relatively recent. And so we haven't quite seen the results. We haven't yet seen impact. There's no data yet to prove impact on that front. And also the corporate reporting and sort of disclosure is only meaningful if it's accompanied by meaningful steps to mitigate and address human rights abuses in supply chains. That it's not enough just to sort of have disclosure as one of the parts of regulation. So the conclusion was there are many positive trends, but I think we all felt similarly that there is not yet signs of impact, and also potentially a gap between what practitioners have experienced and the research hasn't yet caught up to sort of what's actually happening on the ground.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna, for pointing out those factors and trends that you have learned throughout this process. And without further ado, I want to also ask Juliet, in the justice trends, what have you seen? What really works on your side?
Well, thank you, Kenny. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today, and definitely thank you, Delta 8.7. And thanks to my working group, they did a splendid job. It was very, justice matters are very heavy, and we were a very diverse group. But we were able to agree on a few things, especially given the evidence, the body of evidence that we were able to collect. So one of the things that has always been a big question is, what is modern slavery? And I think that was a question, a ringing question as we went along, and this was clearly brought out. So one of the things that came out was, that there needs to be a law that sort of streamlines this, the practice, the definitions, and everything. So that was necessary. But what else really struck me from our information and from the evidence was that the legal and policy frameworks that need to focus on victims and not to criminalize them. I think this has been said, but I think it's wonderful to have evidence to actually back it up, because the victims of modern slavery often find themselves on the other side of the law. And so to see evidence saying, one of the things that will really help in the fight against modern slavery is really to be able to identify the victims and treat them as such. And therefore, we must have a victim-centered approach towards dealing with modern slavery. So I think that was really key. And then, of course, when it came to children, though we noticed, as with the working group, that there wasn't much evidence on children, but there was one of the studies that was there pointed out that there is need to also have a child-centric, child-focused, approach to dealing with modern slavery, which was clearly not there. And then again, together with not criminalizing victims, is to look at counseling, rehabilitation, and other services, which are very, very essential for victims. So for me, it was interesting to just see sort of the justice shift their focus a little bit. Of course, there was evidence saying that we should focus on the training of law enforcement officers And that has been said over and over again, but I think really that the lesson here or takeaway here, and especially for the policies that this guides and the policies that we develop in our countries, is really shifting focus a little bit. Let's look at the victims for once, instead of so much into sort of criminalizing and the criminals and the perpetrators. I think that for me was really key.
Thank you so much, Juliet, for pointing out. Of course, I couldn't agree with you more. A victim-centered approach is very important, but also identifying key services that are dear to the victims and the communities that are affected is very key in the justice process. Now, as we have seen, there is no an ending answer to what works really, as we're still learning. And we also throughout this process, as it was really a tremendous process, I want to ask the chairs, as you chaired these subgroups, what was really your main takeaways and your learning about the process? What can you tell us about that? Maybe we should start with Anna, and then Juliet, and then Catherine.
Yeah, I think one of the things is obviously the UN Guiding Principles related to markets. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights have been around for 10 years now. And I think there's just on the implementation, how much more there is still to do. I think that's but affirming that those are in fact the right principles, that the state does have a duty to protect, that corporations should respect, and that there should be remedy, both judicial and non-judicial. But that we're still learning about how to effectively implement those. That was my key takeaway.
Wonderful.
All right, and then just to follow up with what Anna has said, I think first of all, just from the working group itself, I think the process for me was very critical, and just I thought to myself, well, this is something that can be actually adopted even at the national level, for instance. One of my hope is that this don't become beautiful documents that we lock away in our boardrooms or in our libraries or online, that we actually take them. And I was thinking, how best do we use this process that we have we've endured so far, bring it up to the national level or to the even county level, local levels, and use this process so that we can look at how do we take that, for instance, in the justice policy guides, take those, but beyond just developing policies, also work on the implementation. That for me was a key takeaway, and also because collaboration is one of the key findings of this of the process, that we do need to collaborate, and I think this is the best way to sort of showcase the collaboration, because of the different strengths that the membership brought for the justice working group, and I believe for the other working groups as well. We can clearly see the importance of having each and every person, from law enforcement to the health practitioners, and the kind of focus that they bring when it comes to ending modern slavery. So for me, I see, one is to take this on and to bring it at the national level and see how best we can actually implement it.
Fantastic. And just to build on that point, I completely agree. I think the implementation, but also the importance of collaboration came out really strongly in the crisis working group as well. We had input from a variety of stakeholders, from obviously the great work that Rights Lab did in terms of pulling together this comprehensive evidence review, as well as also getting some more practical feedback from the working group itself. And this was really important because I think for the crisis group in particular, although this probably affected all of the groups, we were really limited in terms of the data that's available. And this is obviously just the nature of responding to modern slavery in crisis settings. Your priority is obviously not collecting data on this and doing robust evaluations at that point in time. So we were really hindered in some ways by a lack of data, but I think that was then helped by having these other practitioners providing this more practical feedback into the actual policy guide process. And that's where those implementation notes that Angarad was referring to in her opening presentation were really helpful for us to both point to what we know at this point in time, but also looking forward to where we can actually perhaps plug some of those data gaps and areas that we should be focusing on going forward.
Well, thanks so much. Very interesting to learn about some of the takeaways and the learnings from the process, including the cooperation, the data gaps, and also other key factors that can help advance us to learn more about what really works, as we have some ideas from the policy guide process. Now, as we know, I think, there is still some gaps in our knowledge. Now, I think the question is, what do we need to do now as we move forward in really addressing the question of what works? Because this is a very complex question. Now, the question is, what do we need to do now as we move forward from your learning? Specifically, for example, if you were to look at what areas do you see a Delta 8.7 should explore in the future? If you have any ideas how that can be done, would be great. Maybe we could start with Miss Juliet.
Well, thank you, Bukene. So one of the things that I was reflecting on in terms of gaps, and from the research that was collected so far, something that didn't come out very well is the aspect of prevention, preventing modern slavery from happening at all. Now, if you think about it, what we're doing so much is responding already to the victims, to crises, and COVID is a good shocker into our system, into sort of showing us there are very many gaps, and we might not be able to. Instead of waiting for the crisis to actually happen, how do we, what do we put in place so that we can be able to address those sort of push, factors towards modern slavery? And I think there's still a gap. There's a huge gap there that I think Delta 8.7 can work on, but not just Delta 8.7. I think institutions, organizations, governments, this is something that we need to relook at instead of waiting so much to react. So I think something for us to think there. And also, one of the things that didn't come out is there's perpetual discrimination of some communities, for instance, that have led them to become victims of modern slavery for many years because of either caste systems, dissent, and all these things. And this kept coming out in our discussions as a working group, that there wasn't enough evidence, there wasn't enough research that was done, that has been done into this. And so again, something else for us to focus on so that we can be able to address modern slavery in wholesome. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now, Anna, same question, and then Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I think because of the lack of research, or the gaps in the research, continued investment in this area, like as Catherine was saying, there is, in terms of the quality of the research, of rigorous standards being applied. It's not, we haven't yet seen significant investment in that related to how modern slavery occurs within supply chains. So that would be one point. And then also figuring out how we can use some of this evidence that's happening in practice. So for instance, whether it's audit data or other types of individual investigations that companies are doing, typically that information is not made public and does not become a research, go into an academic journal of the type that we were able to use. So perhaps trying to figure out whether we can anonymize some of that data and make it applicable so that we can learn from it, and the community of practice can learn from it. And then I would also urge Delta 8.7 to do this again as more research emerges, that this is a very thorough process. We were able to get a very good sense of what's available now in terms of the level of rigor that we were looking for in terms of quality of research. And so hopefully when we repeat it, there will be the quality and the quantity will be higher.
I completely agree with all of those points. I think a gap in terms of measuring preventative policy responses and also programmatic responses is something that we're familiar with across the field. And I think putting more emphasis on that and doing more robust evaluations, looking at what's preventing people from entering into modern slavery, is as important as looking at the impact of programs that actually protect individuals in slavery. From our perspective, for the crisis group, the areas that I think will be really important to focus on going forward is looking at the impact of climate change on modern slavery. We're starting to see some evidence coming through, some came through the policy guide, but I think that's an emerging area that we should be focusing on. the impact of COVID. Obviously, the evidence review took place during COVID. There were a few policy documents that came through that were being picked up, but not very many that were looking at this robustly. So it would be good to look at that in terms of the impact on increasing vulnerabilities, which we speak about anecdotally, but to actually get some evidence behind that. And then one particular group that was limited within the policy guide itself was looking at child soldiers as well. And so that's an area I'd be keen to kind of build out a little bit more, just in terms of themes. I mean, as I mentioned, this is quite a nascent field in terms of humanitarian responses and counter-trafficking responses. So I think that's why there are a few gaps there. And then just to echo Anna's point, that I think repeating this process as more evidence is added to it, I'd be really keen to see how we could create feedback loops on this, so that, you know, people are encouraged to send their evidence in, so that then there's a place that's collecting this to continually build out that evidence base, so that we'll also be able to hear from, you know, all of these different stakeholders that we've already mentioned. So not just going through, you know, trawling through academic databases or international organization databases, but actually providing avenues for evidence coming from grassroots organizations, those dealing on the front line with these crisis situations. So that's an area I would really like to see developed as they hopefully repeat this process going forward.
Yeah, brilliant. So a lot of takeaways.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
May, sorry.
Yeah,
I just want to chime in here that Catherine mentioned. There was very little evidence on children and children as victims, or any response that you can give to children. In fact, the justice group had to sort of, you know, look for more evidence on this. So I think there is an opportunity there for Delta 8.7, and I keep saying it's not just Delta 8.7; it's all of us, because we are practitioners in this area. But I imagine maybe it's because we might not have very good nuanced academic sort of research towards it, but there's I like what Catherine said, there's a lot of information coming from the grassroots level that can actually be used to sort of, you know, start paving way for what, I mean, how to deal with this. Children are a big, I mean, do make a big number of the victims of modern slavery. So I think there is a gap and an opportunity at the same time. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much. Of course, I couldn't agree with you more. There is some category of population that is the most victimized. So I think, you know, to keep, you know, to put an emphasis on that will be something that can be recommendable. So I mean, we had kind of a few interesting questions from our audience, and you know, and I think we have the first question, which is actually for the justice subgroup. You know, that says that question is from the question is from Mr. Peter Williams. He's asking that saying the guide seems clear that justice response might be victim-centered, and that justice interventions must retain a strong focus on specialized, collaborative, and well-equipped law enforcement to bring perpetrator to justice. Now, you say, can you see the victim-centricity principle running alongside the perpetrator accountability principle as the evidence suggests? So that's really to look at these two strands, which is, you know, victim-centered and perpetrator accountability. How do you see those playing together, or they're definitely separate?
All right. I think from the policy guide, I think we're able to see that there is I mean, these are like a sort of a gap, I think so, and we see that there is a bit more, there's sort of a more there's focus on victim centricness, and then there is also the perpetrator centricness. So I think there is need to see if there is any evidence that we can build upon, so that we see how we can look at the, you know, for sort of the criminal aspect or the trial aspect, for instance, and make sure that a victim is able to be voiced, you know, that their voice is coming out properly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much.
If I could just add, Bukeni, in terms of the on the market side, there was certainly quite a few areas where it said the laws are there, they're good, they just need better enforcement. And so on that, you know, that would relate to the justice side needing strengthening in order to complement the other efforts.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. But also, we also know the issue of justice also in terms of is corruption. Time to times we have complained that really corruption is harming very much justice, and that to the detriment of those victims, we try to make sure they can be protected. I have another question here. Probably this will be for you, Anna. And that is about, that's a question from Harriet Resnick. Is asking, do you think that the EU legislative proposals to delink commodity import from human rights violations is one of the steps that will help implement the 8.7 target goals? So, I mean, it may be for you or anybody on the panel, because it's kind of a kind of broad question. So I'll invite anybody to jump in. But, you know, Anna, you have some ideas.
Yes, I mean, in terms of, you know, focusing, connecting the import ban. So the way that the US Customs and Border Protection have issued withhold release orders on goods that are suspected to have been made with forced labor, that has produced, I think, the fastest response by both companies and, you know, source countries. Much more currently than legislation which just requires disclosure in terms of actual responses and the speed of response. So yeah, there's a lot currently in the sort of in the pipeline for the EU. I think the mandatory due diligence is likely to happen very soon, certainly in the next 2 years. Likewise, the Germany law, and that will require both mandatory due diligence as well as, you know, clear steps to address and mitigate human rights abuses within a supply chain. But I still think the import controls are a very strong tool and send a very clear message that, you know, this will not, you know, that economy is not going to succeed if it's if it continues to be an environment where forced labor is not, laws against forced labor are not enforced.
Brilliant. Catherine?
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that as well, just to agree with Anna, I think the shift away from just mandatory reporting requirements to focusing on mandatory human rights due diligence and import bans, as Anna just explained, I think is a real exciting set of tools that we can use to engage with business and to provide that support in order to prevent this exploitation from occurring. We've looked at a lot of the statements being produced under the UK Modern Slavery Act, which focuses much more on this disclosure piece. And we've seen that, you know, 5 years on since that legislation was put in place, disclosure hasn't necessarily improved, and we're still seeing that, you know, the same companies over and over again are reporting that they're doing an awful lot of things, and others are kind of lagging behind. So I think these other tools are really promising. It would be interesting to see if they do go down the withhold release approach as the US has done. I know a couple of other countries also been talking about it as well, Australia being one of them. But yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities there.
Wonderful. There is also Juliet, did you have anything to add?
No.
Wonderful. Okay, so there is another question. We have quite a number of questions from the audience, and we're happy that we can have the opportunity to address some of them. So there's a question from Aman Kumar. Is asking the question, if you see these policy, how can they be implemented in, you know, in all the countries, or how do you see some of the actors implement these policy guides? Maybe Juliet, and then Anna, and then Katharina, if you have, you know, some ideas.
All right. Yeah, definitely. I think this the policy guides are meant for, you know, all of us to actually make use of them. For what the first place I see is because there are a lot of organizations represented here, and I see an opportunity for the organizations to sort of adopt this and work with their policymakers, whether it is to amend the laws or to draft what do we call them, standard operating procedures, for instance, sort of, you know, to give life and to implement this policy guide, so that I keep saying, so that are just not beautiful documents locked away. So I see an opportunity for policymakers within our countries making use of them. I see as you know, guides for NGOs, for intergovernmental organizations to take them on and apply them. And because they have this implementation notes, I think that the implementation notes are quite succinct in terms of the issues that we are addressing. They're very specific. They even have good examples as to, for instance, what is it that one would do. So if you're, say, for instance, carrying out a training event with police officers, you know, you have a couple of examples here and there that that could be put into good use. So these are not just they're not just for, you know, policy formulation, strictly speaking. I think there's, you know, a good opportunity here to sort of for every institution, every organization to actually use them. Yeah.
And on the market side, as increasingly countries are looking to create legislation that regulates corporate behavior, I'd say that definitely needs to be informed by what's the reality, what evidence do we have yet that those new regulations that have been in place for a while are working, what evidence of impact do we have, and ultimately we want to decrease the prevalence of modern slavery around the world and in supply chains. And what evidence of impact do we have that regulation is the tool to do that? We don't yet have that evidence, but certainly this should inform policymakers as increasing countries take on new types of regulation.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
And then just from the crisis perspective, I think there's, as Juliet and Anna was saying, there's kind of a few different ways in which these policy guides will be used. There's at the national level, informing obviously policymakers, those with international overseas development programming, of how they responded to modern slavery in crisis settings. I think there's also, as Juliet was saying, that they're a really important advocacy tool for civil society to show, you know, both in terms of data gaps and where we should be focusing and on plugging those gaps, but also here are a set of 8 concrete hypotheses that we recommend that civil society should be advocating for the national governments to implement. And then thirdly, I think particularly also for the crisis group, looking at the international community and saying, right, well, in crisis situations, we should be making sure that we're putting modern slavery into those processes. So looking at the international mechanisms that exist, such as the Global Protection Cluster, that they are taking on board these guidelines and actually implementing those in responding to crises. So I think there's many different avenues in which these guides can be used right now, and also as they're developed going forward.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for those detailed explanations on the questions that came from our friends in the audience. I know the questions are still coming in, but also I have 2 questions that I will not do justice to myself if I don't ask them. So allow me to ask. So you, the panelists, you know, in each subgroup, the justice, crisis, and market, you have talked about the need for cooperation. That cooperation was one of the factors that, or aspect that you find being very important. So I want to ask you, each and always one, in each subgroup or in each guide or in category, what will it take for that cooperation to be effective? Maybe we can start with Catherine, and then Anna, and then Juliet.
That's a great question. So for the collaboration to be effective, I think linked to my earlier point, is about embedding in existing systems at the international level that exist and making sure that we're mainstreaming these points and these findings through those mechanisms. I also think it's really important that we create effective avenues for this collaboration. The feedback loops that I was mentioning, I think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of data out there, but it's creating a avenue by which we can share that information and then, you know, learn upon that. So I think what's been really helpful with this process of, and, you know, just in general, in terms of looking at systematic reviews, it's a really great exercise for us to take a step back and to look at the state of the evidence out there, and then to say, right, well, we know these things aren't working, or these things look promising, let's maybe investigate those, let's stop doing these things that aren't working so well. So I think it's really important that we disseminate, we create those really effective feedback loops, and then we also embed in existing collaboration mechanisms that already exist, so we're not kind of duplicating it and reinventing the wheel.
Wonderful. Anna?
Yes, I would highlight that collaboration is not a goal in itself, that it is absolutely necessary, but the goal should continue to be what will it take to have impact to actually reduce the numbers of people who are in modern slavery today. And so that often requires a great deal of focus and, you know, perhaps a narrow down, okay, we're going to collaborate with these specific people on this specific goal in this area, and measurement will be the key to that. Actually, are we achieving what we set out to achieve? Collaboration on its own for its own sake is not going to get us anywhere.
Well, beyond collaboration, there's need for coordination. So we have, and I keep saying that the perpetrators of modern day slavery are really, I think they take a chance on just how uncoordinated all of us are when we are responding to this issue. So I think that there is definitely need for collaboration, but coordinated collaboration. That was one thing that came out. And then, of course, there is collaboration at the community level and at the, with the transnational actors. So it's not just, it has to be all the way, both horizontal and vertical as well, so that, we can be able to, shed light on modern day slavery and also do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm not going to ask my second question, but I have a couple questions here that came from the audience that I think are very important. One is from Kumar. He is asking, even in today's era, we are failing to implement the United Nations law in context of different issues. So how can we implement if new policy will be constructed by us? So, here is the question around how confident are we can do this if, at the UN level, things seem not to be going very well enough. Juliet, you want to start if you have some idea about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the need is first, we need to establish the need. We need to understand that this is a crisis for us as a people, as a country, as an organization. We first have to be able to say, this is the magnitude of the problem within our country, and this is what the resources that we have to address this problem, and this is what we want to do about it. So that it's not just a matter of the UN or the international communities handing down rules and tools and saying, you have to do this, but it is first saying, this is a problem for us and we want to address it. And unfortunately, I mean, it has been said that the data that we have on modern slavery is not adequate. It's not, we cannot quite confirm. But I think we can, as countries, I think we can sit down and start developing tools to be able to collect information and collate that information and then be able to address it from there, so that these guides then are able to help us. And I like the way, Delta 8.7 said, well, let's look at what works, and then let us take that and domesticate those for our own use. This is not like, it's not a rule, it's not a law, but saying this sort of has been tested and tried, give it a try as well, but domesticate it at your own level and see. Yeah.
Anna, and then Catherine.
Yes, just to completely agree with Juliet, that typically what happens is international laws translate into, national action plans, national laws, which then translate down into local level, district level. The issue is always in implementation. So it's always a great idea when it starts off, human rights should be respected, protected, but it comes down to how does that actually translate to what a person experiences in terms of, are they protected by the state? Do they receive the services that they need? And so it's that translation into reality that we need to focus on.
Wonderful.
And just to echo both Julia and Anna's points, but I think the laws do exist. Like that's I think something that we've seen in a lot of our research, that at the international level, we have various conventions that focus on different aspects of modern slavery. That's been translated into national law in lots of countries, not all, but in many countries. And then just to build on Anna's point, then it's about translating that and implementing this at the national and then at the local and the community level. So I don't think the policy guides at this point are creating things that are completely new and out there. Like, it's looking at the existing evidence and synthesizing that, and then also just taking that moment to reflect on saying, well, actually, let's see at all the different responses that we have. Let's work out, as Anna was saying earlier, like a kind of laser-like focus on the things that we should be doing more of, and stop doing the things that we also shouldn't be doing, and focusing our resourcing appropriately. So I don't think this is creating a whole new level of policy, a whole new layer of policy. It's just translating this into really kind of concrete action from these kind of international frameworks that already exist.
Wow, thanks so much. So yeah, was very helpful. And I know we have 5 minutes before the top of the hour, and we're still having questions that are coming from the audience. Please continue doing so for the 5 minutes that left. And of course, we like to continue the conversation even offline after this panel. I would like to conclude, in the 5 minutes that remains. But before I can do so, I want to give you, the panelists 30 seconds each. If there is anything you would like to add, so that that you want the audience, everyone watching us or with us today, to walk away with, what will you recommend? Just in 30 seconds, what will you recommend the audience that is with us today to walk away with? If there could be one thing that you would recommend, among others, of course. Maybe we can go with Catherine, and then Anna, and then Juliet.
I think my one thing is to say that we're not quite there in terms of knowing what works, but we're a lot closer than we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I think the key thing is to read these policy guides, to look at where the evidence exists, and then let's focus on where we don't have evidence yet in terms of data collection, in terms of programming, to get to really robust answers to that question of what works.
Then Anna.
Completely agree with Catherine, and also let's move to implement some of these things that we see are promising practices. Let's go all in on investing in this.
Wonderful. Juliet.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Catherine and Anna, and I think implementation is really where it's lacking, and that's true for all of us. But beyond implementation, also resourcing. I think countries need to, and I'm pointing really to our policymakers as well. Like they really need to start resourcing this issue of modern slavery, and putting in place not just policies, but putting their money where the mouth is. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I didn't get time to ask my second question. I know also many in the audience had many questions, but they couldn't get them through us, or they could get them answered. That means we have to continue the conversation so that we can get those questions answered. So I believe Delta 8.7 will be happy to receive those questions. So you have the contact information. We put in all the materials that you may have received. So everybody really feel free to reach out. And of course, Delta 8.7 will be very happy to continue the conversation. With that said, I would like to thank all the panelists, also the chair of the subgroups. The work you did is just monumental. And I can imagine, as an activist myself, how useful this guide will be as a tool for advocacy, for engagement, for policy change. So I would like really to thank you very much for all your contribution, you, the chairs, but also the members of your respective groups. I think this is just the beginning of many more collaboration, as we said, to come. And I think this is very inspiring. Yeah, of course, I will also like to thank the United Nations University Policy Center, Center for Policy and Research, for really putting together, of course, Delta 8.7, for putting together this panel and this very inspiring and exciting discussion. So I would like to end here in terms of the panel. And as I said, the discussion doesn't end here. Will continue even offline. Feel free to reach out, and really we like also to make sure that, as we have heard, it is a call for the Delta 8.7 to continue thinking about, creating these tools so that we can finalize that big question of what works to end modern day slavery. It is a big question and is a huge undertaking. So with that said, so thank you everyone who had time to tune in, and I wish you good night, good day, good morning, everything, wherever you may be. So thank you so very much all.
Thanks, Kenny. Thanks everyone.